Welcome, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to this session on science-based pathways for sustainability. We apologize for not being able to do this session live due to practical reasons. However, we do have some great speakers today, and we hope you will enjoy the session. First, Peter Messerli from the University of Bern will give us an insightful presentation on the expansion of sustainability science needed for reaching sustainable development goals. Then, Andrew Gonzalez from McGill University will provide a critical examination of the need and challenges associated with developing biodiversity pathways for sustainability in the context of Canada. Following this, my colleague Cornelia Krug and I will explain how Future Earth's Science-Based Pathways for Sustainability initiative aims to address the need for a new kind of sustainability science by fostering and supporting a community of practice around sustainability pathways. In the last part of the session, you will be introduced to 3 current projects, part of the Pathways Initiative, that are developing integrated approaches to address sustainable development goals. Without further ado, I give the floor to Peter Messerli, followed by Andrew Gonzalez.
Good morning, good afternoon, dear ladies and gentlemen across the world. It's a real pleasure to contribute to this session. My name is Peter Messerli. I'm the co-chair of the Global Land Program, and I'm also a professor for sustainable development here at the University of Bern. What I would like to share with you today are 2 main messages. I think the first is that we need a significant expansion of sustainability science to reach the 2030 agenda, which is perhaps easy to endorse. But perhaps secondly, that within this expansion, we also need to refine our approaches and advance our science to develop pathways towards sustainability. I would like to share a few slides with you today, and I can hope you see that. Here is a picture that was painted by a 16th century artist, Peter Bruegel, who shows the fall of the Icarus. You can see that on the lower right-hand side with his legs in the water. And what is really interesting about this picture is that the world doesn't care. The world continues business as usual and ignores this heroic deed of scientific inquiry totally. Well, if we think of today's world, perhaps the world had changed. Of course, scientific inquiry has become relevant, but the world is perhaps not fully interested either all the time. But what has changed, that business as usual for the world to develop is not an option anymore. In this time where humanity faces those very essential threats, the world has encoded a vision into the 2030 agenda describing a future that we want. But the question of course remains, what is the role of science? Is it just about warning and describing the problems, or does it have a role to play in finding solutions towards this vision? These questions were exactly the core of a mandate given by the UN member states to a group of independent scientists writing the Global Sustainable Development Report. It was submitted in 2019 to the General Assembly, and as a co-chair of this group of scientists, I would like to share with you 3 key insights and 3 conclusions from these insights that we drew. The first insight relates to the interactions of SDGs. And we asked, what does the current body of knowledge, including scientific assessments, but also major UN reports, tell us about SDG interactions? And you see here on the left-hand side a matrix of 17 by 17 SDGs. And in blue, you see the co-benefits or the synergies that we know about. And in red, you see the trade-offs that were described by those scientific papers. For example, if we strive to pursue the SDG 2 on fighting hunger, on the second line, we will see that a lot of co-benefits can be identified, for example, in terms of health, in terms of poverty, in terms of jobs, but it also implies a lot of significant trade-offs. For example, it would imply about 50% more agricultural land, although it would cause about 90% more greenhouse gas emissions than what we have today. What we see from this analysis that the 2030 agenda cannot be achieved by ticking single SDGs. We would even do it a disservice by ignoring the side effects and the indirect impacts that we cause. But rather we should see the 2030 agenda and the sustainable development paradigm in general as a multiplication where we have to eliminate the trade-offs. We have to address the trade-offs which are stalling progress. And we have to harness the many synergies and benefits that we have identified. It's only through feedback loops that we will reach positive or perhaps virtuous cycles. That's the key to acceleration. It's the key to changing linear progress towards exponential curves of change. To do this, we have to think systemically again, and we have to address the underlying key systems which are currently dysfunctional and producing so many trade-offs. And we have identified 6 entry points for such transformations. The first is rethinking human well-being and capabilities. It's to think about sustainable and just economies. It's the transformation of the energy system, as well as the food system and nutrition patterns. Then, of course, urban and peri-urban development plays a key role. And finally, the global environmental commons need to be systematically addressed. Our second insight refers to the levers and agents of change. And I would like to illustrate that here through this picture of the recent debate about deforestation in the Amazon. New technologies have shown the world what is going on, and everybody was outraged. And the French president has called upon new governance schemes of changing governance to protect the global environmental commons, while the Brazilian president has said, no, we are transforming our natural capital into our economic benefit. Research conducted by the TRACE project has shown for each municipality where there were fires, what was the soy commodity lead chain leading from the municipality to the exporter, importers, and finally to the investors and the countries with their consumers. Clearly showing that, of course, economy plays a key role, a decisive role about the future of the Amazon, and ultimately also society and the consumers and their dietary habits. What we can learn from this insight is that those systemic transformations are only possible if we use the different levers which are reaching across the world. It's governance, it's economy and finance, it's individual and collective action, but it's also science and technology. These levers, of course, can be for the better or for the worse. So we have to discuss about the end which these means are pursuing. And also we need an innovation that foresees the combination of these levers. There are no silver bullet solutions, but we need to break down the silos of these levers and radically rethink the partnerships among governance and economy, among economy and science, etc. Our third insight refers to the contextuality of solutions. This graph by O'Neill basically depicts the donut model on an x-axis where the biophysical boundaries are marked, and on the y-axis where the social thresholds achieved are indicated. And it shows all the countries where they are located. Of course, there is a trade-off between social thresholds and biophysical boundaries. And the ultimate goal would, of course, be to reconfigure nature and people in a way that the footprint is minimized for a maximum social achievements. What I want to say with this graph is that, of course, the distance to target is exactly the same if we live in Australia or Switzerland, or if we live in Bangladesh or Nepal. We all have to reconfigure this relation between humans and humans, but also human and nature. But very importantly, the priorities and needs of these countries are very different, and so will the different pathways need to be. We need every country to design, co-design their own pathways. But what we need to avoid is that those countries follow the old pathways of growing first and cleaning up later. It is of our universal interest that these countries have the capacities and also the science to co-design such pathways. In terms of our approach towards knowledge-based transformation, we see that those transformations are only possible if we combine the different levers. But the combination of these levers must be in a way that it responds to the local needs and priorities, and they are negotiated in concrete societal arenas. Good. Now we can ask, of course, if science is ready to play that role and how we're going to go about it. I would like to say that we are perhaps not ready. We are seeing an increasing gap between what we know and what is actually being done. This gap is even growing. So we have to perhaps reconsider what is an intentional transformation and what is the role of science. And in our GSTR, we basically came up with this graph where we put together, on the one hand, factual certainty and science from high to low, meeting social political agreement from high to low. We could say in this simple field where we have uncontested facts, that's where we all feel comfortable. We know what to do, rational planning, like mosquito nets against malaria, developing vaccines, for example, for the pandemic, or recycling. These are all activities in a very clear and simple world. But of course, there are more complicated issues where I think science has made a huge effort in the last decades to come up with more consensus. For example, on planetary boundaries, on the need for carbon taxation, or the distribution of wealth and income. But these recommendations are, of course, still contested and needs still a lot of political debate. But there are also fields where there is high social political agreement, but still uncertainty for science. These are the perhaps mission-oriented fields of science where we have uncontested knowledge gaps. Fighting poverty, reducing or capturing greenhouse gas emissions, or maintaining social cohesion could be examples. But I think the real challenge that we face is in the middle, in this field where we have no consensus and huge uncertainties, and that's what I would call the wicked problem field. And many of these sustainability issues, those transition issues, are exactly here where we have a lot of contested knowledge gaps, where on the one hand, people disagree what is a solution and what is a problem, and many causes are also effects, and complexity is high. So it's, for example, the transition, an inclusive energy transition, it's the sustainable food systems, or the transition to circular economy. And I think it's here where we need to advance our method and approaches and become more significant. This is a precondition also to avoid perhaps the growth of this field, which I would call chaos, where we cannot know and we cannot negotiate, the field where we talk about tipping points, fundamentalism, or a post-factual world. Good. Taken together, I would come to my conclusion and say, of course, science has a lot to contribute, but it is the role of science to engage, of course, with those global challenges. We are doing a lot of many good things, but I would still doubt that we have really science as a global good, a public good to address those challenges, and that science is fully fit for purpose. If we admit ultimately that the manifestation of complexity is emergence, then we have to be more modest when speaking about evidence-based policies, evidence-based decision-making. I think we have to engage in a new way to create solutions. And we could state here perhaps 3 ingredients which are essentials. We need an understanding of systemic interactions, of synergies and trade-offs in complex human environmental systems that cross scales and places. We have to complement that by engaging with competing development agendas. Science advice needs to be plural, conditional, and involve decision makers and citizens. And finally, I think we have to move beyond advice and be part of developing such pathways, co-creating transformations in very concrete contexts, where we need a debate, the politics of knowledge, where we need concrete experimentation and be part of an adaptive learning. With this, I would like to end, and I would like to thank you very much. I'm sorry for being a little bit long, and I wish you a very good continuation of this conference. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you today and to take part in this session. My name is Andrew Gonzalez. I'm a professor in the Department of Biology at McGill University here in Montreal, Canada. And I'm also the co-chair of GeoBon and the co-director of the Quebec Centre for Biodiversity Science. Today, I would like to talk to you about biodiversity pathways for sustainability, and in particular, the case for Canada. This talk will be about a specific national application of Future Earth's science-based pathways for sustainability initiative. 2020 was a difficult year in many ways. While the pandemic emerged, we learned that the world had failed to achieve its global biodiversity targets set a decade before in 2010. Following this realization, the global community set about preparing a new global biodiversity framework with goals for 2050 and targets for 2030. These align very well with the SDGs and the 2030 agenda. And both frameworks emphasize pathways founded on an integration of co-designed science and solutions. The key to success of the global biodiversity framework, however, is the inclusion of a new monitoring framework that, if funded, will ensure that we can track biodiversity change and assess the effectiveness of policy and conservation action that's designed to put us on a new pathway. Now, the aspiration of the global biodiversity framework is to bend the curve of biodiversity globally. That is to reverse the downward trend seen for many indicators of biodiversity. The U-shaped curve will signify a reversal of our impacts on extinction rates and on ecosystem degradation. Now, inherent to the global pathway is a set of national pathways, each differing and reflecting the many realities of the countries and their context. Now, not all of these will follow the global curve. Clearly, some countries and regions will continue to see declines, while others will recover. But achieving a shift to a sustainable pathway is going to require the integration of different knowledge systems. There's project or initiative-based learning, social and technical solutions, such as nature-based solutions, and systems models and monitoring. We have to achieve an integration of all of these. Particularly important will be bottom-up approaches where communities of practice develop the applications of adaptive learning approaches to nature restoration and renewal. Now, advanced analyses of global pathways that bend the curve of biodiversity are now available. They show that the future might look like for different facets of biodiversity under business as usual or alternative pathways for land use and how it is changing. These graphs, for example, show 3 different facets of biodiversity. And in gray, you can see the line out to 2100 under business as usual scenarios. And in yellow, the case of an integrated approach in which the biodiversity trend is reversed by 2050 for almost all the models considered, but only under dramatic shifts in trade and supply chains, reduced food waste, and more plant-based human diets, among other aspects of social and economic change. Now, these clearly offer an optimistic outlook, but we're going to have to see wholesale social transformation if we're going to achieve this bending of the global curve. Now, a similar curve and a similar analysis has not been conducted for Canada yet. Yet we know that Canada's biodiversity is changing rapidly in response to two broad categories of threat. On the one hand, shown in the figure on the top left here, or the map on the top left, is climate change. Right? The change in the mean and extremes of our climate fluctuations in temperature and precipitation that jointly determine where life can survive and thrive in Canada. Climate is changing rapidly in Canada, in fact, twice the global average, and very unevenly across the country, as you can see from the shades of yellow and red and orange across the map. The second major threat, of course, is the human footprint that you can see mapped here at the lower left. This is the sort of the direct pressures that we are placing on habitats via the land that we are developing for urban areas, agriculture, infrastructure for transport and energy production, of course. And all of these sum to represent our human footprint. Both causes have a striking geographic pattern. And together they are determining the rates of biodiversity change across the country. This map on the right shows the distribution of the 520 or so species at risk in Canada, like this rusty patched bumblebee on the top right. Not surprisingly, we see that the greatest numbers of species at risk are in the south, here shown in red, reflecting the human footprint. But we're also starting to see a pattern of risk that is matching the climate fingerprint, as shown here in yellow. Now, Canada's biodiversity is clearly threatened within its borders, but Canada's biodiversity footprint extends far beyond its borders. Canada is responsible for biodiversity change via its connection to the global economy. That is the trade and supply chains that link our demand for goods and resources that are derived from other nations to the biodiversity change that is occurring in those locations. In this sense, Canada is importing biodiversity loss and change. Now, a striking statistic from a recent trade analysis found that Canada's trade and supply chains rank us as the second highest impact per person on terrestrial mean species abundance. In fact, that is more than 4 times the global average. So we must find integrated solutions all along the supply chain. We can't just place the onus on the end consumer. Now, it is in this context that the Montreal Hub of Future Earth convened a workshop to address biodiversity pathways for sustainability in Canada. The workshop convened representatives from different sectors of Canadian society, including government, NGOs, academia, and representatives of Indigenous communities. And the first workshop was remarkably productive and led to a number of conclusions and related policy recommendations. And I'm going to list just 4 here. The first is that clearly Canada, as the second largest country in the world, with the largest coastline in the world, clearly can influence biodiversity and ecosystem outcomes globally, which means that policies at national and subnational levels can profoundly influence conservation outcomes, not only in Canada, but around the world. We must connect biodiversity impact with supply and value chains. And of course, to the ecosystem services and the beneficiaries through an ecosystem accounting framework. We need to integrate biodiversity solutions throughout the economic system. Third, we need to facilitate cross-scale collaboration. That is, we need to engage local communities, NGOs, citizen groups, and municipalities and provincial governors in a coherent set of strategies for biodiversity conservation. Right? Biodiversity change is happening at all scales, and so we must apply our methodologies and solutions in a way that's commensurate with this scale dependence in biodiversity change. And lastly, we must combine Western and Indigenous knowledge systems for biodiversity monitoring. We have to adhere to the FAIR and CARE principles for data use. Together, these will establish a culture of data collection and data sharing that connects the data providers with the data users and the decision makers. And Canada lacks this integrated system that it needs to set itself on a pathway for biodiversity sustainability. So one of the take-home messages from the workshop for me was the concern about the great uncertainty in our biodiversity future because of the geographically and taxonomically limited information about the status and trends in Canada's biodiversity. Now, this makes prioritization of policy and decision-making extremely challenging, especially if we're trying to shift onto a sustainable pathway in the coming decade or so. Now, back in 2010, the Ecosystem Status and Trends Report of Canada concluded we lack long-term standardized, spatially complete and readily accessible monitoring information. This is significantly hindering our capacity to assess the status and health of Canada's ecosystems. Now, this message is still true today, some 10 years later. But why does it matter? Well, we can't adapt or achieve a sustainable biodiversity pathway if we don't know where, why, or how our biodiversity is changing. Now, a major component of the sustainability pathway process will be the inception of a process to establish a biodiversity observation network for Canada. The goal here is to follow the best practices and principles developed by GEOBON, that is the Group on Earth Observations, the Biodiversity Observation Network. GEOBON is part of GEO and is a global community of practice linking more than 1,700 members across 117 countries around the world. GEOBON is known for its open process for sharing methodologies to quantify essential biodiversity variables that support robust and reproducible monitoring. GEOBON also supports the development of biodiversity observation networks at regional and national scales. Now, a BON is built on a broad partnership network that combines all sectors of society in a co-designed process of BON development. A BON broadly networks existing monitoring efforts and all groups from Indigenous peoples to corporations, civil society, and government departments and institutions. Essentially, a BON links data and the knowledge generators to the data users on the right-hand side here, that is the decision makers. And it is a sustained effort to actively engage all partners in the generation of relevant biodiversity knowledge. It creates a feedback cycle where the people involved in data collection are more likely to promote the use and collection of additional data to act on the decisions it supports. It is a continuous process of co-design and a co-development of monitoring practices and its application to conservation via biodiversity protection and restoration. We just recently launched a Canada-wide call for expressions of interest, and we received a remarkable number of organizations and individuals willing to come together, a sort of a collective of the willing, if you like, or a coalition of the willing that are committed to designing this biodiversity observation network over the coming year or two. So these are exciting times for Canada. We're at the early stages of progress towards a new path for biodiversity in Canada. We have a federal government that is committed to biodiversity policy and the 2030 agendas, both for the Convention on Biological Diversity and the SDGs. And Canada has many effective conservation NGOs and citizen groups with exceptional resources for biodiversity research. So together, via the working group and other initiatives across Canada, we are addressing these 3 points that Peter addressed in his talk before. We're seeing synergies and trade-offs in these complex human ecosystem interactions, and we're learning how to deal with them via on-the-ground conservation action. We're getting together the groups to ensure that science advice is plural, conditional, and engages decision makers and citizens at every level. And we're seeing the co-creation of local successes, that is this adaptive planning and learning, and the translation of this knowledge across the ecoregions of Canada. So there is an optimism that we can adopt transformative practices that will not only lessen Canada's biodiversity footprint, but rather the adoption of nature positive practices that will see Canada contributing significantly to bending the curve of biodiversity worldwide. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Professor Peter Messerli and Professor Andrew Gonzalez for their overviews of the transformations needed in sustainability science. I'm Dr. Cornelia Krug, Director of the Future Earth Global Research Network Biodiscovery and Science Policy Liaison at the University of Zurich Research Priority Program global change, and biodiversity. I will now introduce the Future Earth Initiative, Science-Based Pathways for Sustainability to you. Complex spatial and temporal interactions exist between the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. These interactions must be accounted for in order to provide a common, integrated global framework for peace and prosperity for people and the planet, now into the future, as set out by the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the SDGs. Published in 2019, the Global Sustainable Development Report lays out a framework for researchers, practitioners, decision makers, funders, and civil society to work together to achieve universally acceptable and mutually beneficial sustainability science. The report not only highlighted the limitations of the current dominant research modes in reaching this goal, the report also identified the urgent need to produce knowledge and understanding in 3 key areas: systemic interactions, competing development agendas, and transformation in concrete contexts. The Future Earth Initiative Science-Based Pathways for Sustainability aims to be an inclusive and integrative response to the pressing need to produce knowledge and understanding in systemic interactions, competing development agendas, and transformations in concrete contexts. The initiative also aims to serve as an incubator for engagement to build understanding of, first, how interactions at various scales in complex human environment systems produce synergies and trade-offs within a context of competing development agendas and claims on resources. Second, how transformations can be mobilized to enable expansion of integrated pathways to sustainability in diverse concrete contexts. And thirdly, how pathways and processes of transformation, which are likely to differ between places, giving differences in histories, contexts and values, interact across locations and scales, creating both tensions and synergies, and add up to outcomes at the regional and the global levels. The initiative supports the development of an open community of practice. It convenes researchers from diverse disciplines who engage with societal actors, for example, civil society, governance, or the private sector, in processes of adaptive learning to design, implement, and evaluate pathways to sustainability. These processes are key to meeting the pressing challenges of advancing the Agenda 2030 and to better understand the diversity of values that shape visions for desirable futures in different places. They also help to understand the processes that lead to transformations, as well as the uncertainties, trade-offs, and co-benefits that can emerge from the interconnections between sustainable development goals at various scales. With this, I'd like to hand over to my colleague Gilles Marciniak to tell you more about planned activities of the initiative. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cornelia. Realizing that a community of practice does not appear with the snap of a finger, the Pathways Initiative endeavors to create a space where you can discuss and explore the concept, design, implementation, and evaluation of sustainability pathways alongside experts from the natural and social sciences, as well as the humanities. Our plan is to articulate this space around 3 conduits for engagements: bi-monthly forums, collaborative activities, and the promotion through our webpage, newsletter, and briefs of the work undertaken by the community. According to the definition, a forum is a place to meet for open discussion. The Pathways Forum will serve exactly that purpose. Starting from September 2021, we will open the Pathways Forum every 2 months for 1 to 2 hour sessions, during which experts will have the opportunity to share with and learn from each other on the role and development of pathways in sustainability science. Depending on the topic, this will be done either through presentations followed by questions or as roundtable discussions. We plan to hold each forum according to one of three rotating thematic streams. Self-reflection will be an honest and critical look at the state of transdisciplinary research and sustainability science today, highlighting their effects in concrete contexts and their implications for the research community. Capacity building will be a way of acquiring knowledge about methodologies and practicalities involved in the development of pathways. And finally, in Parallax, we will invite experts from different perspectives and disciplines to have an open discussion on a particular topic relevant to sustainability pathways. We can already announce that the first Pathways Forum in September will be a self-reflection forum dedicated to the implications of sustainability science for research practices. The development of the Pathways community of practice also relies on a series of collaborative activities stemming from the community and supported by the Pathways Initiative. These collaborative activities can include networking events, working groups, thematic or synthesis workshops, and summer schools. They will all be targeted at fostering and supporting the transformation of research practices needed for understanding systemic interactions, competing development agendas, and transformations in concrete contexts. Example of such collaborative activities will be presented in the last part of this session. Last but not least, we give a lot of importance to promoting and giving visibility to your projects and activities. If your project is relevant to Pathways, please do not hesitate to reach out to us to have it featured on the Future Earth website and the Pathways Forum or in our newsletter. Incidentally, we encourage you to subscribe to the Pathways newsletter through our webpage to stay informed of the latest news from the Pathways community. Your passion for sustainability pathways, combined with the conduits for engagement I have just presented, will result in a community much needed for advancing and transforming sustainability science and for paving the way towards a sustainable future. The Pathways community of practice is likely to become a game changer in the unfolding of what the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development calls an integrated global framework for peace and prosperity for people and the planet, now and into the future. So join us as we journey along pathways for sustainability.
Mountains cover 13 to 25% of the terrestrial land surface and occur worldwide. Whether shaped by the thickening of the terrestrial crust or by volcanic activities, they are characterized by steep environmental gradients that cause rapid transitions across different climatic conditions and successions of ecosystems. Mountains are exceptional in many ways, in particular in the extraordinary biological diversity they host. Likely because of the rapid change in climatic and life conditions, exposure, and topography with elevation, they support an estimated 1/3 of terrestrial species diversity. Among those species, many are endemic and found in so-called biodiversity hotspots, of which many are in mountains. Because of their topography, climate, and biodiversity, mountains support a variety of ecosystem services, which is to say, the important contributions from nature that arise from healthy and well-functioning ecosystems. Ecosystem services contribute substantially to the livelihoods of people in the highlands, but also in the surrounding lowlands and far beyond. Mountains are home to almost 1 billion very diverse people. The way mountain peoples use the land has shaped mountain ecosystems over centuries and profoundly influenced mountain landscapes and their biodiversity. Faced with the challenge of food security, many mountain communities have developed resilient production systems. But climate change, population pressure, and other factors, such as global trade, are putting increased pressure on these fragile social ecological systems. Mountains are particularly exposed to the impacts of global change. One of the most important changes is in land use, such as the conversion of pristine forests to agricultural land, or the intensification of agricultural practices from subsistence agriculture to large-scale, intense monocultures of cash crops with the help of pesticides, insecticides, and fertilizers. Over-exploitation of natural resources, such as intensive logging, represents another threat for mountain ecosystems and their populations, notably because of the resulting increased risk of landslides, especially on very steep slopes. In the face of ongoing and irreversible changes, urgent action is needed to safeguard mountains and their people worldwide. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, formulated by the United Nations, provides a powerful framework to achieve a sustainable future. This framework consists of 17 Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs for short, adopted by all United Nations member states in 2015 as a call for action towards safeguarding people and the planet. Presented as indivisible, these goals are, however, not independent from each other. Increasing food production or improving infrastructure, for example, often imposes environmental costs. Understanding how and why these goals interact and how to minimize the trade-offs between them is therefore necessary to make progress towards their achievement and to identify knowledge-based opportunities for decision makers. This 4-year international Research for Development project investigates whether conserving mountain ecosystems, SDG 15.4, trades off with other development goals in mountain regions. We want to understand how we can address competing sustainable development goals in the context of limited resources and complex governance structures to achieve long-term sustainable development in mountains. The research will be undertaken at 3 different scales: global, national, and subnational. At the global scale, we will acquire data on communities and ecosystems in as many of the world's mountain ranges as possible using online questionnaires. These questionnaires will be based on the conceptual framework adopted by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. At the subnational and national scale, we will carry out field surveys and participatory workshops in mountain ranges in Tanzania, Nepal, and Bolivia, across gradients in elevation, land use, and governance. A very important element of this project is the inclusion of the knowledge and expertise of local people and stakeholders and the delivery of the project results to them. Mountains play a vital role in safeguarding cultural and biological diversity. They also provide critical ecosystem services that affect the well-being of billions of people. Identifying paths to sustainable development in mountain regions is crucial for achieving the SDGs globally. By working with mountain communities across 3 continents, this project will hopefully identify promising ways forward.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening everyone, wherever you find yourselves. I'm Ariane de Bremen. I'm the Executive Officer of the Global Land Program, one of the global research projects of Future Earth, and it's hosted at the Center for Environment and Development at the University of Bern in Switzerland. I'm extremely excited to share this new initiative with you on behalf of the steering committee. And I wanted to give you a little bit of insights into some of the ongoing projects and planned activities, just as ideas and templates for the kinds of things we could do together. So just as background, you've already heard the Science-Based Pathways for Sustainability is this global initiative that Future Earth that will support the design of sustainability pathways while accounting for possible synergies and trade-offs between the sustainable development goals at various scales. And what we've talked about already is that one of the central challenges to defining science-based pathways for sustainability and this has been mentioned so far a few times, is that of conceptualizing and addressing the roles of cross-scale and cross-national telecoupled, as we call them, telecoupled interactions. And this is because the flows of capital and commodities and energy and people and waste often span multiple territorial jurisdictions, and the achievement of particular goals within one delimited territory is necessarily connected to a dynamic set of relationships and spillovers that link multiple places near and far from around the world. And we know that we're talking together and we're all connected, and somehow we're distributed throughout the world. Another recent challenge is the development of increasingly ambitious integrated global targets, addressing both biodiversity loss and climate change. And examples of that are the Global Deal for Nature, recent effort. And so the implementation of science-based pathways for sustainability in any national context requires a few things. First, it requires the definition of some type of clearly delimited goal. Second, it requires an assessment of what kind of key systemic interactions, both conflicts and synergies, and emerging in local places and also transnationally, are implied in meeting that goal that you're going for. And third, it requires an assessment or reflection on how these can be mitigated in some cases or harnessed. And the fourth sort of main principle in thinking about these kinds of targets is the question of what kind of knowledge do we need to embark on that pathway, and understanding what that knowledge is and understanding how to get it. And so the idea here with kind of thinking through the implementation of science-based pathways in a national context would require a science-based process that would allow then a deliberation amongst the key relevant actors distributed throughout the world, and also in specific contexts on the governance of such systems, and really attend to the need for collective decision-making in those contexts. So in the context of this effort, the Future Earth Paris Secretariat and the Global Land Program, together with other GRP participants, are convening a workshop. It was planned pre-pandemic, and we're hoping to have it in the fall of 2021. We are convening a workshop to explore how we could begin to develop prototypes to do this kind of work in specific contexts. So in the context of this effort, we say we're supposing that we're starting from a given jurisdiction, like a municipality or a region or a country, that is characterized by a group of stakeholders within it, and also define sustainability objectives. And we're going to explore with this group and with these scientists first, how we can identify candidate frameworks, theories, methods, and tools drawn from the field principally of land system science that would support the detection and evaluation of these telecouplings, of these cross-scaled interactions and connections. And so the overall aim of the workshop is to marshal the frameworks and the theories and the tools of land system science towards a better understanding of how national or subnational pathways can be developed to reach a normatively defined objective. That is, objectives that are defined by their relevant stakeholders and that can take into account these inevitably telecoupled cross-scale interactions that characterize so much or pretty much all of today's sustainability challenges. But beyond advancing the science of designing pathways for groups of actors to achieve sustainability objectives, the workshop is intended to contribute to the design and prototyping of future processes that would be carried out with defined stakeholder groups, identified problem sets or sustainability challenges relevant to their context. So it's a great laboratory and place, this workshop, to experiment, to bring together scientists to imagine how we could do this with the goal of actually being able to implement in the future. And then we will be planning, along with the whole Pathways Initiative, subsequent workshops to pilot the methods and approaches with participants, specific actors, and stakeholder groups. So just to give you a flavor for the kind of work the community of practice can do together, we will really look forward to updating the community of practice on this workshop and their findings, and finding new ways to explore and leverage these findings towards other new initiatives within the Pathways community of practice. Thanks for listening. Take care.
With me is Odirilwe Selomane, the Executive Director of the Program on Ecosystem Change in Society, also known as SPECS. He's here to tell us about the Just Transition in Biodiversity Governance project. Odi, hi.
Hi, Gilles.
Would you mind telling us a bit more about this project?
Yes, of course. This project is a collaboration between University of Bristol, Stellenbosch University, and University of Bath, together with Future Earth, in which we are looking into how the concept of just transitions, which is predominantly used in climate transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy, could be applicable to biodiversity transitions. We will be doing this by in two ways. The first is reviewing the literature to try and find out how the concept is used more broadly, but also whether it's being used in biodiversity more in particular. And then we will be looking into 3 case studies, 3 cities in Japan, here in South Africa, and 1 in the UK, where we'll be talking with city managers to understand how they are using this concept in their specific cities. And the main goal is to really understand how it can be applicable to biodiversity more specifically, where it's not being used to our understanding very much at the moment.
I see. Would you mind clarifying for us the difference between justice and just transitions in the context of biodiversity conservation?
Right. So as I understand justice, it is something that is applicable at all times. So people are, justice is justice, whether something is changing or not. We seek to have justice. Just transition, as it has been used in the climate movement in particular, it has applied to where industries are shifting from an undesirable industry like coal, for example, to a sustainable one. So there is a deliberate change that is being implemented, which has good intentions by definition. But in that transition, some people are being left behind. So it is very specifically to a deliberate transformation that is put in place and trying to safeguard against that, perpetuating the current inequities or leaving people behind as a result of this deliberate process. So the distinction is really based on the transformation that is taken, particularly towards some sustainable outcome. Yes.
And this concept of just transitions is currently, would you say, not very well integrated in the field of biodiversity then? And if so, how would your project contribute to remedy this?
Yeah, in our understanding, we don't think it is used very much in biodiversity. Of course, there are other concepts such as environmental justice that are sort of talking about similar issues that are being used. We know people have been talking a lot about environmental or human rights in the context of protected areas. And so, our understanding is to try to, with our first part, which is more literature based, we're trying to understand how this concept is currently, or whether it is used at all in this space, and how it is used. And secondly, to try and bring it into the conversations that are ongoing, for example, in the context of the Global Biodiversity Framework that is currently under negotiation, that since we know from history that protected area, new protected areas, so some of the goals are around increasing protected area expansion by 30% by 2030. This will require lands formally getting protected. And we know from history that this often means people being displaced, human rights being trampled in particular cases. So if the process of declaring new protected areas as an example of this transformation does not explicitly take into account the impact this will have on people, we think we will have missed the mark. And so our work is really bringing this attention to the fact that all transformations essentially will leave someone behind unless we deliberately prevent that.
I see. So quite critical, fundamental, important work.
We would like to think so, yes.
Thank you. Now, how do you see, in terms of reaching the goals that are set by the project, how would you see the value of the Pathways initiative in being successful?
I think the Pathways initiative is quite critical because I think the process of transforming from one thing to the other is fundamentally a process of choosing a pathway. So from the perspective of conceptually, that is very well linked to the initiative in general. But I think on other fronts, I think aligning with the Pathways initiatives also brings popularity to the project, or in terms of communications. The Pathways initiatives could be a really useful platform to communicate both the intentions, but also the outcomes that are coming from the project. And we're really, really excited about aligning with the Pathways initiatives.
Odie, thank you very much for taking the time to tell us more about the Just Transition in Biodiversity Governance project. And we very much look forward to hear more about its development. Thank you.
Thank you, Gilles, for inviting me. This was nice to talk to you.
This concludes our video session. Thank you for watching. I'd like to thank Peter Messerli and Andrew Gonzalez, as well as all the people involved in the Pathways Initiative projects presented during the session. We look forward to hearing from you soon, and in the meantime, we hope you enjoy the rest of SRI 2021.